Hey everybody, it is your professor, your coding friend, and the fastest ship in the fleet. And today we're going to talk more about the grid because it's got a lot going on. So first thing, go to Canvas, find the code, make sure you're logged in, make sure you hit remix, make sure you change the name of it in settings, and you're ready to go. So last time when we talked about the grid, we talked about containers and elements. So you apply the grid to like a div or figure or something that has children in it, a parent. And then those children inside of that element or inside of that container become elements that you can shove around and order and space out and all that good stuff. We talked about how you can make rows and columns, which is a lot easier to do in grid than it is in something like Flexbox. We talked how to do gutters, the space in between elements, and how to do grid area in order to minimize your code. For advanced grid, we're going to talk about grid templates and how you can use things like you did in Flexbox to align and distribute things within the grid. So first off is grid template area. So grid template area allows you to sort of name each of the children and tell those children where to be in your grid. So here I've set up grid template area, and inside of that I have quote and another quote, and then I have 2 words. And here you can see over in these children, I've assigned grid area head to this first thing. And so grid template area is going to go, hey, is there any children called head? And it'll look over here and it'll be like, ah, there's head. It's going to go at the top and it's going to take up 2 columns. Because I have 2 words here with a space. It's like, ah, 2 columns, first row. And then I go to the next line and I have 2 quotes and I have 2 words in them. So it's going to go, ah, this is the second row and it also has 2 columns. And then also next row and next row. So by seeing this, it's going to know that because I have these 4 lines, that I have 4 rows, and because there's a space between these 2 words, that means there's 2 columns. So you can just sort of visually see it. It's a little bit easier to keep track of than grid area because visually you're seeing your grid as you're laying it out. The thing that you have to keep in mind is that you have to go into the children and you have to name them so that it knows where to place nav. And it's not going to place nav twice. It's just going to say, hey, nav is going to take up these 2 columns, so it's going to be 2 columns wide. And you have to make sure that you keep that exactly the same. You can't have nav and nav. It's not going to know what it is. Okay. All right, so let's try it out. Let's do some coding. So we're going to go into our code. We're going to go to .grid in the CSS. We're going to change it to display grid so that it starts using grid. And we're going to add grid template areas, and then we're going to create 2 columns and 4 rows like I showed you in the example. And it's going to look like this. I'm going to type it out as I'm doing it, so you don't have to screenshot it, but it's here if you want it. All right, so let's do this. So here in my code, you can see in the HTML, I've got some Pokemons. There's no reason I picked these Pokemons. I think they're cute. And they had similar color palettes to them because that's the amount of design arbitrary that I am. My favorite starter Pokemon is obviously Charmander, but these have more soft pastel palettes, so Charmander was out. Inside of my CSS, you can see down here I have .grid. .grid is here. So it is the thing, the container that holds all my Pokemons. And so I'm going to add grid to this container, and it's going to make each of these things elements inside of my grid that I can shove around. It's the Pokeball, if you could have multiple Pokemons in a Pokeball. Why don't they do that? You could throw 1 ball and then like 5 of them would pop out. Anyway, so let's go ahead and start up the grid over here in .grid, which is just display : grid. Okay, and then I'm going to start my grid template column. So that's just grid dash template dash column. Awesome. Colon, and then, oh, sorry, grid template areas. I misspoke. It's grid template areas. All right, and then I'm going to start my quotes, and then I'm going to have Mudkip take up the first row, and I want to have 2 columns, so I want them to take up the whole first row. So I'll just say Mudkip space mud kip. Awesome. All right. The first thing that's happened is my grid has noticed, hey, there's 2 words up here. That means you're trying to make a 2-column grid. It hasn't made Mudkip the whole first top part because I haven't gone into Mudkip yet and given it its name. So eventually I'm going to go in and declare this little box Mudkip, and when it does, it's going to take up this whole first row. But right now it knows that it doesn't, like, all of these children are nameless, orphans, and it knows that I want 2 columns, so it's trying its best. So I'm going to go to my next row, and I'm going to say that I want this to be both pip-plup, pip-lup, space, pip-lup. So he's going to take up 2 columns too. Next line, I'm indenting just so it's easier for me to keep track of stuff. Chimchar is going to be on the left side, and then I want Cyndaquil to be on the right side. I'm just putting Cynd because Cyndaquil is too long, so extra. I also quite like Cyndaquil. Cyndaquil is very cute. I have a soft spot for fire starters. And then on the bottom, I just want Torchic. Torchic. Okay, beautiful. And so now to actually get this to apply, I'm going to go down here, and in Mudkip, I'm going to say grid. My dog better not bark. Someone out front, I can hear him. Micah, you gonna do a pork? Oh no, you're being good. Excellent. Grid area, Mudkip. Boom, there it goes. All right, and so then we're gonna do pip-lip. I'm gonna say grid dash area, pip-lip. Ah, there she goes, there she goes. I would be robbed so many times if I didn't have my dog barking at all the potential intruders. I hear her go. Oh, hell no. She protects. She attack. Cyndaquil, grid area. Cynd, make sure that you're spelling these right because it will not do it if you don't spell them exactly the way you spelled them above, and it's not going to throw you an error either. That's one of those things you're just going to have to see with your peepers. All right, so there we go. So we have our 4 rows, 2 columns, and the first 2 and the last one take up both columns, and then these 2 equally divide. We did it. We made a whole grid. All right. That's cute AF. All right, we already did that. All right, and so now that just by default evenly divided them up, but you can still decide on how wide you want them to be. You can still set the width and the height of things. So we're going to go in and we're going to change the width and the height just like we did inside of our last exercise. So we're going to say grid template columns, and we're going to change it 200 and 300. Okay, so under here, oh, I forgot. Semicolon. You still need that for this one. Okay, so grid dash template dash columns. And we want the first column to be 200 pixels. And we want the second column to be 300 pixels. Let's just divide it by a space. And so there you go. You can see the difference in that Chimchar takes up less space than Cyndaquil now. So left column's 200, right column's 300, because we did this. Fix that. And we can do the same thing with rows. So let's update our rows to be this. And again, that's just grid dash template dash rows. And we're going to do 150 pixels space 200 pixels space 300 pixels space 200 pixels. And we need 4 numbers because we have 4 rows, and so we're indicating the height that we want each of these rows to be. And if I look over here, you can see that my second one is bigger than my first one. This is super big, and then a little smaller. So we've customized the size of our rows and columns. So as you are moving stuff around, we talked about this in some of the other properties that we've done for things like when you do position sticky, you can have things overlap. You can have things overlap in grid. You can indicate when things should be sharing the same row or the same column, and you can get different like children inside of a parent to overlap on top of each other, and which one goes on top has to do with the order or with the Z index. So just like when we did Z index when we were doing position, you can say an individual child has a Z index of high number and it will go on top. 0 is the bottom of the stack, high number higher up on the stack. And so you can do something like this where you indicate that these two boxes should share some row or column cell. And then this one, because I say Z index 10, which is a fairly high number, it will pop up on top. So let's try it out. So we're going to go into the next grid that I have that doesn't have any Pokemon in it because, yeah. And we're going to change it so that 1 looks like this. It takes up the first 4 rows. There's only 4 rows. And it takes up the first 2 columns. And so remember that this is the start of the row. This is the end of the row. This is the start of the columns. This is the end of the columns. And whatever end you use is that column plus 1. It just is, that's just what it is. So we're going to go into here and we're going to say, oh, first I'll show you the thing. So we're doing these down here. This is the grid that we're working on for the overlap. I've got 3 little cells inside of here. Right now they're equally divided. Okay, and so for 1, I'm going to say grid area and 1, 1, 5, 3. And I didn't have to do spaces, I just like it. So here you can see that my first column is now taking up 4 rows and it is taking up 2 columns. And it's sort of shoved the other ones over. Because I didn't specify, so it's just like, whatever, they go wherever. Okay, so now we're going to go into cell number 2, and we're going to say, hey, take up the rest of the space. That's going to be very sad for number 3, but I'll show you what happens when we do that. So this is going to, they're not overlapping yet, it's just going to take up the other half of this parent area. So for grid 2, for dot 2, I'm going to say grid dash area colon, and we're going to do start on 1 for rows, start on 3 for columns. So this one ends at 3. So we're starting at 3 here. And then end at 5 for rows, and then end at 5 for columns. And so now this is what it looks like. So my 1 and my 2 have the first half and the second half of this space. And then this poor third one down here, it starts up a new row, but it shoves it super tiny because I haven't specified how wide another row should be. I haven't given it any indication. So if there's no room left, it'll just squash it as much as humanly possible. It's just, so that's what happens. So we're going to change it so that we're going to have that third one, instead of being squished like pancake, we're going to have it overlap in the middle of our other 2. And so here, these are our in-between numbers. It's going to start on row 2 and end on row 3, start on column 2, end on column 3. And we're going to give it a Z index of 10 so that it's on top and doesn't just end up hiding behind the other stuff. Okay. So grid area, we're going to say 2, 2, 4, 4, semicolon, and we're going to say Z index 10. And now if I scroll down, bloop, it's on top of the other things. It's pretty cool. Okay. So you're getting a lot of control over layout now. So now we're getting into organizing cells inside of your grid. So just like when you were using Flexbox, you can justify and align content or groups of content inside of your grid. So justify items is the same thing as what it was in Flexbox. You move things along the main axis, left and right, and you have the options of start on the left, end all the way on the right, center in between, or stretch where it fills in that whole space. So if you wanted everything to be centered, you say justify item center, and they would center in whatever row they're in, left and right. So let's go ahead and try it out. We're going to do justify items end inside of .grid. So we're going back to our Pokemon. Yes. All right, and under here, I'm going to say justify items end. Boop. So by default, they were doing stretch. They were filling in that whole space. But now that I've said end, those boxes around my Pokemon, bloop, become as small as they need to be widthwise in order to still accommodate that image. So they're as wide as the image is. And they've shoved all the way to the end of that row that they were in. So Chimchar just moved to the end of that 200 pixel space, that column that I made. So it's just shoved over to the right end of that first column. And then everything in that second column, or that did both of these columns, is shoved to the very end of that space. Cool. Justify content moves all of the stuff together within the grid. So you can use these values of start, end, center, stretch, space around, space between, space evenly. This is very familiar to when you used Flexbox. They work exactly the same way. Space around adds a margin, space between gives you no margin and evenly spaces them. Space evenly divides the space between each of the stuff, and so on and so forth. So let's go ahead and do justify content so I can show you what it looks like. First, we're going to make our box bigger than our grid so that we have some extra space to move our grid around within. And then we're going to do justify content end. So first, let's change the width to 600 so you can see what this is doing. Up here, I'm going to do a new line and say width, boop, 600 pixels. Okay, so now we've got a bit of a bigger space. And so you can see here, our container is bigger than our grid. So our grid ends here. And that's because here we've said, hey, it's this wide, which is 300 plus 200, 500. But now it's 600, our container. So it stops a little bit early. It starts here and it ends here, and we have this extra space left over. Well, if I wanted my whole grid to actually go to the end, I can do justify content end, boop, and it shoves the whole grid over to the end of this container. And so now that extra space is over on this side. Cool. Align items is that other axis, the secondary axis, up and down. So you can have things be in the center of their row, the top of the row, or the bottom of the row, or stretch to fill all the way to the top and the bottom. So we're going to try each of these. We're going to say start, end, center, and stretch, just so you can see what each of them are doing. And we're going to end with stretch. So we're going to do align items, and I'll show you start. So by default, you can see they stretch. Now, when I say start, it just is the height of that image, and the image stays at that top of its row. If I say end, bloop, it goes to the bottom of that height of that row. If I say center, it bloops the center. It's easier to see on the Mudkip. And then if I say stretch, it fills in that whole height. We're going to keep it on stretch. Align content, same thing. It's going to shove that whole grid up, down, center, vertically, align it vertically within whatever container it's in. So these are all of the different values you can put in. We're just going to say center on this one. We're going to change the height to 1000 so you can see what it looks like if your grid is smaller than the container it's in. And then we're going to align content to center. Whoops. Okay. So align content. And we're going to say, I had the words 1000 pixels. So now my, this like box here that we're working in is like super tall. Is it? Did it get tall? Oh, I did align content, not height, Lord in heaven. Okay, so we're going to delete that. We're going to go up here to height. We're going to do height. 1000 pixels, not 100, 1000 pixels. Okay, so now it's, there we go. So now it's very tall. And we're going to go to align content. We're going to say center. Bloop. And so now whatever extra space is evenly divided between the top and the bottom. Oh, my face is in the way. There you go. Okay, cool. It's people outside again. You good, girl? You good? Gotta stop them robbers. All right. You can also move around individual content. So if you want to do align self or justify self, you can do that for specific items. Okay, and so we're going to do that for our mudkip. We're going to, well, I already did in for everything else, so that's not going to change anything. So we'll change it to like the start. We'll do something that changes it. So we're just going to do justify self something for just .mudkip. Beep. So let's go down to mudkip. Justify self. Start. Boop, there he goes. So you can have individual control over these two. That's a bit fussy, but it's possible. You can. Move my head back. Okay. So far we've been doing explicit grids. We've been telling it exactly what we want. We've been putting in the numbers. We've been saying four rows, 2 columns, but you can imply it. You can let the grid figure it out for itself and just do an implicit grid. And so what that looks like is you do auto rows or auto columns. So here I've explicitly defined, hey, make 2 rows and 2 columns. And then if there is more content that can fit on there, create a new row that's 50 pixels high and put that content in there and keep going. If you run out of room on that one, make another row that's 50 pixels high and fill in the rest of that stuff. And so it's not explicit, it's saying, hey, figure it out for yourself. And so that's what grid auto rows is. You can do the same thing with columns too. Usually you'll do it with rows. So let's see how it works. We're going to go into our CSS and delete the height from .grid. And we're going to go into our HTML and we're going to uncomment the surplus Pokemon I have in there. And then back in our CSS, we're going to add some auto rows with 156. So let's go do that. So inside of our grid, let's just real quick get rid of the height. And we're going to go into the HTML. You can see here I have some extra items commented out. Go ahead and bring them on back. They're just an additional Torchic and Cyndaquil because I am unoriginal. And so then we're going to go into our CSS. We're going to go to the bottom. Beep. And we're going to say grid auto rows 156 pixels. Lord. 150 pixels. Why do I think 156? And so there you go. It automatically created a new row that's 156 pixels high to fill in that extra content down there. Cool. All right, so you can also say how you want new things to be added. You can say grid auto flow. It's going to create new rows with new content. So say like you're on a clothing website, you're building a clothing website, and right now you know you have 150 items, but maybe you don't know how many items are going to come in with the new winter release. You can say, all right, when the team adds in however many new sweaters, go ahead and create new rows from left to right. And so you can say grid autoflow rows, and it will automatically do rows. But maybe you're doing a tablet version and you want it to make new columns that you scroll through. You can instead say grid autoflow columns, and then instead it's going to start adding columns to the end of it. You can also say auto fit. So you can have things that will change the number of rows or columns depending on the size of the screen or the number of things that you have. And what I mean by that is here I've got grid template columns. So I'm establishing how many columns I have. Then I'm saying repeat, which means do this over and over again. And in the area where I say like repeat twice, which would mean 2 columns, or repeat 3 times, which means create 3 columns, I say auto fit. And then here, for the size, I say, for everything that you put inside of these columns, make sure at minimum it's 200 pixels, and at maximum they're evenly divided. So you have even rows, and if the screen gets smaller and smaller and smaller, it's going to evenly divide up that space and make as many columns as it can until it gets to 200 pixels. And then it can't go any smaller. And so then it's running out of room, and so it's boop, it's going to create a new row. And then it'll divide up all the space again. You'll have 2 rows that are evenly dividing up the space until they get to 200 pixels, and it can't get any smaller, and boop, it'll make a 3rd row. So it's automatically creating a number of rows or columns for the content that you have and the size of the screen that you have. Very responsive. Okay, so actually, I'll show you what that looks like. So here in my HTML, you can see for this very bottom column down here, I just have like a bunch of empty little squares, just like a bunch of them, just like so many. Move my head up, so many. And in my CSS, it's under .autofit grid. And so you can see here I've done grid template columns, and I've done the exact same I talked about, but it has a minimum of 50 pixels, and otherwise it will evenly divide it. And so here you can see it's evenly divided up the space for each of these squares until I start, ooh. And then once it can no longer create 50 pixels, give 50 pixels space for these columns, it'll boop, create a new row. And then it'll keep, and it'll just keep popping them down. And if I get even smaller, I'll make a 3rd row. It's so nice. It's so good. It looks really complicated. I hate looking at this. There's just so many words and things going on. But look at this responsive grid system. It's so cool. For something like this, it's much more visually easy to keep track of. Like, obviously, it's 2 columns and 4 rows. But then every time you need a new thing, you have to go in and manually insert it. And here, it looks like word spaghetti. But man, you never need to go in and fuss with it anymore. Just go. It's great. It's magic. It's so cool. Okay, so just to review what we did today. We talked about grid template areas. We talked about how to do justify and align in grid. We talked about doing implicit and explicit grids, auto rows, auto columns, all that good stuff. And next time in class, we're going to review advanced gridding. And I'll see you then.